Hello, Spark fans. Welcome back to Advancing Spark, where today we are getting fairly nerdy. We're talking about our favorite thing in the world, which is development. Like Spark code. It's kind of what we do. But, it's been a long time for us Sparky people developing things in the browser. And I've forgotten what it's like developing things properly, locally, with an IDE. And that's what we're talking about today. So, a little while ago, 2 months ago, they announced the public preview of a thing called Databricks Connect V2. And that's actually built on the back of an open source thing called Spark Connect. Now, they announced this back in the last Data AI Summit, and they said it was coming, and they had a whole great demo of using an iPhone connecting to Spark, all that kind of good stuff. And yeah, you can now do it. So we're not going to look at Spark Connect itself. So Spark Connect itself, you need to spin up a Spark Connect server and allows you to talk to any Spark environment. There's a little bit of setup there. But Databricks Connect V2 sits on top of Spark Connect and allows us to use a local IDE, allows us to use a load of things. So we're going to take a look at one of the out-of-the-box demos about how to use Plotly using Databricks Connect V2. And then we're going to take a look at what happens if you use the Visual Code Extension. So there is a VSCode extension for Databricks Connect V2, which allows you to do it without having to code anything. So two different ways of working, both working with a local IDE, both giving you super flexibility. And yeah, that's the plan today. So nice bit of coding for a change. As always, if it's your first time around here, don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, if you're learning Spark and you're trying to figure out what on earth I'm talking about, don't forget, we do have our Spark Fundamentals training on our training platform, and you got that Spark Fans discount when you sign up. Right, let's go have a look what we're talking about. So, this was a blog post that was announced talking about Databricks Connect V2. Now, Databricks Connect has been around for a few years, but it had a couple of limitations. There's a few things you couldn't do. The way it communicated with the Spark cluster wasn't quite right. So this is not the same Databricks Connect. Entirely different protocol, built on the back of Spark Connect. Databricks Connect V2, the only thing it has in similarity with Databricks Connect V1 is the one, well, it's connecting to Databricks, and it's got the same name. Apart from that, different protocol, different way of working, lots of different stuff in there. And I'll put a link to this blog down below. You can go and have a look about how things work. This is the demo we're going to have a bit of a look at. We'll pull it apart and see what it's doing. But yeah, that's what we're doing. Interactive dev, debugging, being able to step through code line by line and see what's going on even inside a notebook cell. Missed it. I missed it, but I'm also hilariously rusty at actually coding in an IDE. But still. So that is the plan. So first things first, let me pull this over. So this is the demo that chap Martin put together. Lovely guy, did a webinar with Martin, Stephanie, and Denny just recently. And they are sharing some of the stuff. We talked through some of these demos, but I thought I'd share it here on the YouTube anyway. And yeah, if you want to have a play with Databricks Connect, you can have a play with this. So it's a pre-built little application. It's just using some sample data, puts a little bit of a UI over it with Dash, and then it actually just uses Plotly to do some charting. And it's using some sample data that is baked into a Databricks workspace if you're using Unity Catalog. Now that is a big requirement. If we're talking about Databricks V2, you have to have Unity Catalog enabled. You cannot use it without. Spark Connect, if you're doing your own Spark server, actually you can use on any Spark cluster. It doesn't have to be Databricks. It is an open source thing. If you're using Databricks Connect V2, has to be using Databricks, has to be using Unity Catalog. So that was my first mistake. I started using it, it wasn't working, and it was because my workspace wasn't UC enabled. Kind of makes sense. Fine, there has to be something acting as a server, similar way to how it acts as a Delta sharing server for you. It's acting as a Spark Connect server for you. So next thing, we need to look at the requirements. So we'll step through this. We'll have a look at requirements, and then we'll have a look at this little bit of code. We need to tell our Python how to connect to Databricks. And if you ever use the Databricks CLI, this will be super, super familiar. So I'll show you quickly how that works and where that fits in. And then we'll have a look at the actual app and we see it working and all that good stuff. Let's get rid of all that. Let's go and see some code. Okay, so Visual Studio Code. I've got it set up. I've actually got Python installed locally. I've got a Python virtual environment installed. I have set things up in advance. So we talk about the requirements, it's fairly limited, right? So we've got dash, plotly, Databricks Connect. That is what needs to be installed. And Databricks Connect comes with some dependencies, niceties, sort of, builds in some of the things you expect to be installed. So my local Python environment is set up to be able to work with PySpark and various things like that, which Databricks Connect is going to go call some of those libraries and expect them to be installed. So first step, easy. Make sure you got those things installed. Run it in a virtual environment if you want to stop breaking your local Python environment, like I did when I first started running things. And then the only thing we need to do, this is just the absolute plain, this is the straight from the Git repo. I've cloned it, I've brought it down. You can see it brings a load of stuff in, brings these two important things in. So I've got Databricks Connect Session, Databricks SDK Core. So the various things like getting my Spark context, so I can actually do spark.read, etc. We need that Spark session. So these are our Databricks Connect libraries that we're pulling in, and we're going to be using those things. So in the app, it then does a load of things with Tailwind, with kind of Dash. It basically gets the UI set up for us. We skip over some of that stuff. Most important things in here. So we've got config being set. So taking that config that we imported from that Databricks Connect library, I need to give it a profile. Now that profile actually links to a file called databricks.cfg. And if we go in the terminal, just get my terminal up. Yes, that's allowed. Thanks. There we go. And if I go Databricks. So if you've ever had to set up this terminal, which I appreciate it's a bit small there, and we go Databricks configure, that then gives us the ability to put in our host name of our workspace. It'll then ask us for a pat token. And when we actually do that, when we're calling that Databricks configure, we can give it a dash profile, and it remembers that as a profile. You need to have done that on the local machine that you're using so that Databricks knows what we're talking about. So when we say profile Unity, that is the CLI profile I've configured with the profile name of Unity, which is why it has my workspace ID in it, and it has the pat token. It has my personal access token from Databricks, knowing how to connect to Databricks. Now, with those two bits already in there and already on my local machine, just saying profile equals Unity means it knows to look at that file, knows how to connect as me. That is my whole authorization done. Authentication. Yeah, words. I've named a cluster ID. So I wanted to run on a specific cluster. I've come in, I got into my Databricks workspace. I've looked at that cluster and I said, yes, please work on that cluster for me. And that makes life a little bit easier. Your cluster needs to be running because my code's going to run on my cluster. Kind of makes sense. These things have to talk to each other. So yeah, that's the only thing I need to set up. So with that in there, with that configured, if I come in here and say, go and just run that Python, so just app.py, go and run it, I can see that kicks things off. So Dash is running on over here, so I can click on that. It's going to open it in a different window. Here we go. It's loading my page. Whoop. Going to take a minute to run. There we go. So we can now see this is the demo. Spun it up. And there we go. That's actually gone off, spoken to Databricks, ran this on Spark, and you can see this is going off, running that code, getting a receipt. So this is live, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to my Spark cluster to actually answer these questions. So that the Python is running locally, but then anything where it says Spark, anything it would normally send to the workers from my driver is being sent over to Databricks to be executed on that cluster. So it's pretty cool. Just works. I mean, that's quite nice. Now, obviously, that is a very shiny demo. That is a demo where I've not had to change any code. I've just put in a config and said, I'm going to trust that this thing works. And obviously, I don't trust anything. I'm a cynical old man. So firstly, let's go and have a look what's actually happening. So I've got my Databricks workspace here. I can see my little cluster that was running. So you can see that clusters, oh, you can't really see that. 0503, QV, IV, blah, 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 blah. You can see that 0503, it is that cluster that I'm pointing to. So this is the config page for that same cluster. If I dive into the Spark UI, we can see these things are running. So that thing's just being kicked off. We can see execute plan at Spark Connect service. So we can see that is coming from Spark Connect. That's not being run locally. That's coming in from that thing. I can go and have a look at that. I can see what's happening inside that query to see what's going on. Same thing as if I ran it locally. I've got all the normal good Spark UI stuff. I can just run my code. That's good. So based on that, I'm very happy that it is actually not running on my machine, it's running on my cluster. That's good. Proof. But that doesn't tell us enough, right? This is just some app code. Maybe there's some secret source. Maybe it's more complicated than that. Told you, I'm paranoid. So what I did was grab some of that code and pull it out into a separate little Jupyter notebook, essentially. So I've got that same import statement from the top of that Python script, pulling in my Databricks session, pulling in my config, all of that stuff. I've got that same config and Spark session bit, so I'm pointing at my Unity profile, I'm pointing at that same cluster ID. And then I've just taken one of the functions from inside that app, just copied and pasted that whole Python def over, and we can test and see if that works inside a notebook. Let's just run that. Go, everyone's happy. Just run it locally, hit Control Enter. That's all metadata. It's only this bit that's going to hit things. And there we go. Because the cluster's warmed up, it goes off, runs it in exactly the same way. There's nothing special about it being inside that little web app. It's just Spark code I can run locally. And I was having a look and going, well, if that can do all these things, what's going on inside this function? Well, spark.read, dataframe.with column is just running Spark code. So I can come in here and go, well, actually just create that for me locally. That works. That seems happy. I say, well, what is that thing? Oh, there we go. It's a data frame. Exactly as you'd expect. It's gone off, got that from the sample data inside Unity catalog that's already registered in my Databricks workspace, pulled it back as my data frame. I can go and inspect that variable, and it works. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool. So this is option 1 for using Databricks Connect. So inside my code, I've had to pull in a special library. So my code has the Databricks Connect libraries included in it. And I've had to include this, which is very specific to the machine I'm running on. I need to have called it that Unity in my own Databricks config for this to work. And it's hard-coded to look at a certain cluster. Now that's great if I'm doing a local app development and I'm getting it right. I'm going to bundle it up and put it somewhere else to be deployed. That's fine. We can work with that. Especially if it's always going to use Databricks Connect. If I'm using this in such a way that this app isn't going to sit inside Databricks, it's going to sit somewhere else, and it's just going to use Databricks to go and fire some code at to get some code back. That is cool. That makes sense. But if I'm using this to do my local Databricks development, and the end state is this is code I'm going to deploy to a Databricks workspace and run via a job and have it in a workflow and all that good stuff, this doesn't work. I don't want to have these libraries in my code every time I deploy something, or a little big switch statement saying, if you're local, do all this stuff. If you're not local, do this other stuff. That's slightly annoying. But luckily, there is another way. So this whole piece is using Databricks Connect V2. It's using it manually just via Python and then injecting some stuff into it. So if I go and close that folder down, I'm going to open another folder that just has a little demo code in there. So there's just a DBX folder I made. And this has got some stuff in there, and I'll talk about what these other bits and pieces are in a second. Essentially, this is just from our training course that we run. What we normally run in Databricks, we run a training course. It uses various different notebooks. In this case, it's talking about how window functions work. So import window, PySpark import functions. This thing I'll talk about in a second. And then we've just got some code going off, just bringing in a data frame, bringing in some sample data, starting to do some data testing. So that is my local code working, well, not working. It's got no config. It doesn't know how to connect to anything. I'm not giving it a local profile. I'm not giving it a cluster ID. So this, as it stands, wouldn't work. However, what we're going to use is a thing called the Databricks extension for VS Code. So I've installed an extension. So I've had to go into extensions. I've got to go and find Databricks, install that ID support for Databricks. And what that means is down here on my side now, I've got Databricks. So I now have a extension installed into VS Code specifically for using Databricks. And there's a few things you'll see here. One, I've got this little Databricks Connect enabled button right down at the bottom. So this is currently working using DB Connect. So Databricks Connect V2 is baked into this extension. It's still using that same protocol and Spark Connect under the hood, but instead of me including it in the code, I have a separate little wrapper, a separate little extension just in VS Code. So you can see a few things here. So firstly, I had to set my workspace up. So I can go and configure my workspace. Then it looks in my local config file to say, well, which of my profiles that do I have set up here? And I did have a big long list, and it had some sensitive names. Someone just deleted most of them. But you can see I've chosen to use that same Unity profile. So that's just nice, good. We're going to use Unity there. It's logging in as me. It's just using 80 pass-through. No, it's not using 80 pass-through. It's using my PAT token. That's all plumbed in. And then on there, I can connect and say, well, which cluster do I want to use? And this goes off, talks to that workspace, brings back a list of clusters. So I was like, well, I would like to use that singleton cluster. And you can see, well, there we go. It's found the cluster. I can currently run code on that cluster. I can stop the cluster from here if I want. I can start the cluster. I can see what's going on. I can see that I'm being really cheap because it's a single mode cluster. But, you know, it's fine. And then we've got this thing. We've got a sync destination. Now, essentially what it does inside of Databricks, it actually spins up a little subfolder inside Databricks repos. So from making any code changes here, I can sync that so that gets replicated over and actually puts those same changes out into my workspace. That'll plumb up quite nicely. So you can see I had to turn on syncing. I'm like, please go start working. See, it's currently watching for changes. So as I make changes in here, that's just going to be auto syncing, pushing it out to Databricks repos to help with the asynchronous running of things behind the scenes. So that is now currently set up and running. Now, I'll admit, I did have a couple of quibbles getting this actually set up, making sure I was using the right cluster type, making sure I was on Unity catalog enabled, getting that sync cluster stopped working originally because I had two files that had the same name. One was a Python file, one was a Jupyter notebook, but they were called the same thing, and that caused the collision. So be careful. There's one or two little tweaks you need to be a little careful about. But otherwise, once it's actually set up, so go through that process, identify your config, see the workspace, see the cluster, and go into my Jupyter notebook now and go, is it going to work? So again, I can just run a cell. That works happily. That's running locally in my machine. And then now I can go and create my Spark session. Now, unlike my code in the other example, I'm just using a generic Spark session. So I'm saying, well, get one or create one and just return it. Now, Databricks notebooks automatically give you a Spark session. You don't need to run this code in a Databricks notebook. Because this isn't a Databricks notebook, I'm having to go off, instantiate it, bring it back. Basically, I'm just saying, give me the one that you've already created for me, but just tell me what it is. And with that, that means I can run things like spark.createDataFrame. Now, the nice thing, well, why are we bothering doing this? Why are we making such an effort to have a coding environment, whereas I could just log into the browser and do it there? Well, you can see I've got a little breakpoint enabled here. I want to be able to debug this locally. I want to be able to hit F10, step into this code, and actually step through it line by line and see what actually happens. So I can step past there. So I've ran data. I can go and see what data is, and I can inspect that variable. I can make sure that actually got created properly as that variable. I can then step over, go down. I can make sure, is that a data frame? That is a data frame. It's being created properly. I can get the information from it, and I can step and finish that code. I can step through, debug my code now. That's fairly huge. Actually, if we do that again, we step through it another time, we can actually go and switch in VS Code. We can get up the debug window, and actually we can step through as we're debugging and actually sort of see how things are working. I've actually got double debug session. There we go. So there's two port stacks open, which is always going to confuse it. I just disconnect those. Here we go. So you've got visibility of things that we didn't have before. We've got the ability to actually step through things and see how things are working. And again, same as before, if I'm going on my compute engine, I can see what this is actually calling. I can see where this is actually pushing things down. This is still going through and running things via the Spark Connect service. So it's pretty huge. Pretty cool that I can just go and run code. I can be working through the code I've normally got and actually running things properly. Now, a couple of different tweaks. I mean, I'm using a Jupyter notebook here, so I'm having to do .show, not display. There's one or two things. If it's baked in, if it's expecting it to be a Databricks notebook, not a Jupyter notebook, you're going to have to make sure things are compatible. But Otherwise, I can run through, I can test my code, I can see if things are working, I can work on it like I can in any other Python IDE. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So you've got a few different things to get used to, a few different choices about how you work. You can use Databricks Connect. You need to have some libraries in your actual Python, and you need to have a configuration pointing to something local in your Python. Or you can use Databricks Extension for VS Code, or whatever IDE you're using. There are ones cropping up for IntelliJ and various other development environments and other IDEs. And it's just essentially just using that approach provides a wrapper so you don't have to have it in your code, and you can take this same code and put it into prod with some testing and, you know, due discipline and some code linting and formatting and yeah, all that stuff. But yeah, that is all I wanted to show you today. So yeah, it's pretty darn cool. We've got the ability to do local development, and we can do it via a number of different ways. It is using an open source thing called Spark Connect, which we heard about last year, but we can now actually have a play with it. Databricks Connect V2 gives us more Databricks functionality. There's more things on top of it that are Databricks specific, but it does require Unity Catalog. You need to have things set up. But more and more, we're seeing that from Databricks. We're seeing a new feature, and it's like, well, you can use that new feature, but you have to have Unity Catalog. At some point, there's no escaping it. You'll have to have Unity Catalog to use anything that's new and cool in Databricks. So, makes sense to jump on it, adopt it when you can. Yeah, pretty cool. So, love to know what you guys are thinking about that. Are you already using it? Are you looking at that going, oh, actually, we're going to change entirely how we develop? Or are you looking at going, you know what, that's nice, but you know what, we use online development now. We're used to developing in the browser, and we're used to building notebooks the way we build notebooks. And yeah, it's interesting to see how people actually change things, how people actually take this and run with it, and what they build on top of it. How many more dev tools and accelerators we're going to see just for Databricks notebooks, because now we can actually hook into an IDE to do this stuff. And that for me is the exciting bit. The more getting the Databricks power tool, getting all the extra super building extension stuff to say, well, yes, it's not just about saying, can you write your code locally, but it's because you can write your code locally, what can you achieve? So much stuff in there. So that is all I want to talk about. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll be around for another video soon. Cheers.